Great. Well, welcome everyone live and those who will be watching the recording. We'll start with just a minute of mindfulness, just as a way to help us arrive and settle into the space. And the invitation is to maybe just pick an object in the room or pick your breath or maybe the sole of your feet touching the ground and just allow your awareness to rest there, knowing that it's inevitable that your attention will go elsewhere. And just a curiosity about that when that happens, and in that moment deciding if you want to come back to allowing your attention to rest there or somewhere else. And as you rest your attention either on your breath or a different part of your body or something in the room, just notice what arises for you. Maybe there's a lot of chatter. Maybe you're noticing how your body is talking to you. Maybe you're tuning in to how you're feeling. Or that it's really hard to be still in this moment. And every time you notice that your attention has started to explore another object or a story, just noting that with curiosity. When you're ready, starting to bring your awareness back into the space. I'm so glad you decided to join me to talk a little bit more about self-care and wellness practices. And just to give you a little background of maybe why I decided to offer this to the community. And part of that is I think that the transition from August to September, or transition from one season to another season, can bring up a lot of different energy. And some of us transition with ease, and some of us have more difficulty challenging to different seasons and different months and different rhythms. And just a reminder of what are the practices that we can engage in that help support us in the various transitions. Just share my screen. So my name is Natalie Edmond. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and 500-hour trained yoga teacher. I loved to teach mindfulness and asana practices for many years, and I weave that into a lot of the work that I do, and I try to be really grounded in how do we make practices trauma responsive? How do we make them attuned to our nervous systems? And how do we allow them to be not oppressive? So I think for me, the dance always is what are the evidence-based practices? So what has research told us is really, really helpful. And that research is often done on a population that's not always representative of the broad expanse of who could benefit from these practices. And because I do a lot of anti-racism and anti-oppression work as an anti-racism consultant, as a diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging consultant. How do we decolonize some of the practices that we've learned? So this word decolonizing may or may not be familiar to you, but if we just think about that, in the United States, we often refer to um, the United States was once inhabited by, millions of indigenous people, and in their various tribes. And when colonization came and there was the genocide of indigenous people, over time, those became the culture, what is known as the United States. And I want to honor that. I'm in central New Jersey, the land of the Lenni Lenape. So decolonizing is just a way that we start to maybe peel back what we've learned and come back to nature, come back to indigenous, come back to maybe what we may know to be true inside of ourselves and our ancestors may have known to be true. So that's the dance, is how do we do both? How do we recognize that there's wisdom in a lot of different traditions and one isn't better than another, even if one is known more than another or is maybe respected by some people more than other people. So I like this quote that I found about decolonizing wellness. So decolonizing wellness means to decenter whiteness in wellness spaces. So meaning that oftentimes wellness practices have been colonized, or often the images that are represented to us of who embodies those wellness practices or who partakes in those wellness practices are people who appear to be white. So how do we allow people who are Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, the global majority, which is like 80% of the world, how do we help them see themselves in the wellness practices, and how do we reconnect them back to those wellness practices that their ancestors may have been engaging in that promoted healing and community? So reclaim the wellness practices that are rooted in various cultures and religions but have been culturally appropriated. It also means to honor the complex histories of wellness practices and to make some form of reparations to the communities from whom the practices were taken. So these practices, how do we make them more accessible to everyone, regardless of wealth, race, body size, and disability? And often I think of wellness practices as associated with class, with how much financial resources people have to take the time to engage in these wellness practices, but also to have access to it. I think about being a 500-hour trained yoga teacher, which means I went through a 200-hour yoga training and then a 300-hour yoga training and many other trainings in between, and how the majority of people in those spaces were white-bodied, and yet the yoga philosophy and yoga traditions come from South Asia. And so how did it come to be that something that was full of brown bodies isn't represented like that way in the United States? So that just gives us a little background of how I came to be here and how I'm kind of trying to integrate these multiple worlds. So I often think about, what kind of regulator are you? Which seems like a funny question, but when I was being trained in sensory motor psychotherapy, I loved how they talked about that there are basically two different kinds of regulators in the world. And so there's the self-regulator like myself, which means that when I'm out of my window of tolerance, when I'm feeling overwhelmed or shut down or anxious, stressed, I tend to want to be by myself. I like withdraw, I go inside myself. I like to do activities that are solitary, and that helps me get back into my window of tolerance, my optimal level of arousal. It helps me soothe myself. And then there are interactive regulators, which are the people who prefer to be with other people when they're upset. and they do better by taking in the energy of other people and being supported. And I think about that these are not like one is better or worse than the other, they're just different. And so I think about, which one are you? Are you more of an interactive regulator? Are you more of a self-regulator? Maybe it depends on how you're feeling and what's going on. And I think it's just helpful to know, because that will help inform part of your self-care plan. So when I think about how do we decolonize wellness, we have to understand the roots of the wellness practices we enjoy and how they've been altered to maybe fit with mainstream culture, and respect where they came from to begin with and honor that and give them credit. So I think a lot in terms of the nervous system, in terms of the body. And I didn't always think that way. I used to be very much cognitively oriented, very much in my head. And I love Deb Dana and the way that she's adapted the polyvagal theory from Stephen Porges. And I want you to think about what's your window of tolerance, which is your optimal level of arousal. That's when your social engagement system is online. That's when you feel safe and social. You're alert. You can learn. You can engage with people. You can. There's more mobility in your body. You can make eye contact. There's more range in your vocal cords in terms of how it comes out. Your head can move side to side. And in that space, you're in a system of connection. You can have compassion, flexibility, joy. There's just more fluidity. And when the amygdala, which is our alarm system, scans the environment all the time for danger and novelty and things that potentially could be a threat to us, we can get into a sympathetic response, which makes us mobilize for action. And that's often fight or flight, or even maybe fix. And we're just more aroused, hyper aroused. And that could be the way our body may stiffen or change. It could be our heart rate changes, our breathing changes, the thoughts may be swimming around, and we may be prepared to fight or to flee and escape, or we're problem solving, fixing, keeping ourselves busy. And that can appear frantic and obsessive. And sometimes when the threat is so huge, our system gets so overwhelmed that we go into a dorsal vagal response and our system shuts down. We're numb, we're collapsed, we're disconnected, we're conserving energy. Maybe we're binge watching shows, we're just hiding under the covers, our body wants to minimally move. And we are, as human beings, moving up and down this ladder of regulation all day long. Some of us move more than others. Some of us live in certain zones more than others. I think of all three of these as different zones. And I think about how self-care practices, how wellness practices can help us stay in our window of tolerance for longer periods of time, and how it can kind of help protect us in some ways from some of the stimulation that happens in our world so much of the time. So when we're in our window of tolerance, that's often called kind of ventral vagal activation. And I often think about, like, how can I move into ventral vagal energy, or how can I stay in ventral vagal energy? And sometimes I'm just in a mood where I'm more dorsal vagal, like I'm just withdrawn or quiet, and I just think, what's a glimmer, right? A glimmer, that's a Deb Dana word. Like, what's a glimmer that could allow me to smile or to have a little bit more ease in my body? Maybe it's a memory I'm recalling of, some memory of like joy or being in nature, or something my kids did that just allows me to shift a little bit. So when we think about practices, whether you're a self-regulator or an interactive regulator, thinking about what are the things that activate you, what are the things that trigger you, and what are the ways you resource yourself. So if we think about resourcing, and again, thinking about we need all of these zones to live a full life. It's not that, we only want to stay in our window of tolerance, because sometimes we need to fight or flight. And sometimes we need to do that dorsal vagal of freeze or fawn or collapse. These are strategies, stress responses, and maybe even trauma responses. So when we think about resourcing, I think about like, what are the mental things I can do to help engage in self-care? And what are the physical things I can do? What are the ways I can be connected to nature? And what are the ways relationally I can have that be part of my self-care plan? And I love how we can think of certain activities as being many of these things. Like I, for a long time really enjoyed yoga, all aspects of yoga. It was a mental thing for me related to meditation, and also just like being present for the moves and the asana, which is the movement part of yoga. So that's the physical part. Maybe I would do yoga outside, or relational. Like there's something different for me about doing a class in person with other people, or even attending the class live, even if it's virtual, than if I'm just watching an on-demand recording. That's less relational to me and less interesting, less engaging, less resourceful for me. So thinking about for yourself, what are activities that you might do that is that maybe hits all of these. I know for myself, nature is the hardest one for me to achieve. I think last week I like purposely made myself in the morning take a chair into my backyard to be outside and be with nature, because I don't spend enough time in nature, and I like to look at it from my office window. But there's something about being in nature, taking that in, that I want to try to increase in my life, especially as we move into the fall season on the East Coast. So for many, many years, I used this Healthy Mind Platter to talk to clients, and I loved it. And it's from Dan Siegel and his colleagues. And the way that, I've always educated my clients about it is that this was created to be something that accompanied the food pyramid of like, these are the activities that we should try to incorporate in our daily life as much as possible. And that these 7 areas help our brain and body function at its optimal level. And so the more I've talked about it, the more I've adapted it over time. And so that's part of what I'll share today is how do we do these things, which we know has been well researched, and that there are probably other things we could add. And I created 10, but I'm sure we could come up with more than 10. So when I think about sleep time, I think about what's the amount of sleep that my body, my nervous system needs in order to be the best person I can be, right? And for me, that means like I'm not irritable, I'm alert, my body feels pretty good, and and think about how CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, kind of talks about best practices related to sleep. And so what's my sleep hygiene? Like what's my routine that I do at night that's going to support me in going to bed at a fairly predictable time, and I'm going to wake up at a fairly predictable time? And how do I unwind from my day that allows me to sleep? And what happens when I miss my window, and like how do I minimize missing my window? And so when I think about like most people, it's like somewhere in the 6 to 8 hours range, right? That most people don't sleep 8 hours. And so like for you, right, you might be one of those people who says I need 10, right? And so your nervous system about like what is that about? Right? Is that we have these formulas, and yet your body's going to tell you what it really needs. And some people are going to need less sleep, and some people need less sleep most of the time, and then they go on vacation and they sleep more. And so, how do we keep that in mind? And then I think about physical time is, exercise. What do we know about the ways in which, exercise can be like a natural antidepressant, and it can be a way to manage anxiety, to channel energy, to get endorphins flowing, and like how much exercise do you need, right? And there's so much, I feel like, conflicting information out there, right? Is it what activity and how long should that activity be, and how do we measure like how we're taking care of our bodies? And so how do we get in tune with our bodies and what our bodies need? Focus time, which I think of as time that we are engaged in a task or work or volunteering or studying. Maybe we feel productive. We feel like we're contributing in some way. There's some meaningful activity that's happening. And noticing if we're spending too much time focusing, and like how long can our body and mind really focus before it starts to distract itself and lose stamina and energy. Connecting time is time we're spending with people, connecting. Um, and the more we can hear people's voices, the more that we can be with them and in person, how much, that's something that we need as humans, because we are tribal people, even if we're people who prefer to be alone some of the time. And I think of how texting or social media scrolling isn't the same as, a video chat or in-person chat or talking to someone on the phone. It doesn't do the same things to our nervous system. And yet some connection is that's like really engaging is better than nothing. And playtime, I think of playtime as like creative time, fun time, silly time, like just accessing a different part of our brain, a different part of our ability, and that we need that as part of our daily routine. Downtime, which is unscheduled, unproductive time. So, time where there's nothing that needs to be accomplished, where it's just about being. Maybe it's we distract ourselves, maybe we watch things, play a game, whatever that might be for us. And for some people, that's rest, right? That rest is something that maybe some of us don't do enough. We don't give ourselves permission enough. We are a little critical of ourselves when we're taking time for ourselves. And then time in, which would be time in is any time that we spend in self-reflection or meditating or praying, journaling, yoga, time that you go inside of yourself and see what's going on in there. What's happening? What's the noise? What's the chatter? What are the patterns that you're noticing? How's your body talking to you? And that it doesn't have to be very long. For some of us, that's 5 or 10 minutes. And for some of us, that's like 30 minutes, an hour. So including that time every day allows you to check in with yourself and see what's going on and what maybe needs to change. So the last thing I'll say about this slide is when I used to talk to clients about this, I don't use this as much anymore, but I used to think about, what are the things you do regularly? What are the things you tend to neglect? Of these 7 things plus eating, which would be 8. And when you're stressed or overwhelmed, what things do you neglect, or you say like, oh, that's optional? And then what are things that you would protect and make sure that it's part of your maintenance plan? I like this idea of maintenance because it means that I'm saying like, this isn't self-care like an additional activity. This is like my maintenance. This is what allows me to maintain myself. And so I'm going to try to be unapologetic about it when I can, most of the time, and recognize what are the barriers sometimes to engaging in some of these things, and how do I prioritize. I think about sometimes I'm out of sync but I'm like really in focus time and I'm not doing enough downtime. And sometimes people are so much in downtime that they don't do enough focus time, or focus time inhibits sleep or physical time, or people can't make room for time in meditation, mindfulness, yoga, any of those kinds of practices. So this idea of like anti-oppression, right, is thinking about how self-care or caring for oneself or having this maintenance plan is a way to preserve ourselves, to maintain ourselves when there's so much political angst going on and so many people feeling like their rights are being taken away or not respected, or they feel like they're being attacked for what they believe in. And so, this idea of how do we move from just surviving to thriving, and how we think about ancestors, people who came before us, and what they would want for us, and how do we embody that and make that happen. So, when I think of the 10 wellness practices, what did I add? So, some of it I kind of talked you through. But the three things I really added was our relationship to technology. That I think living in this digital age where everything is moving so fast, and just like on our little devices, our phones, we can be accessing so much content. And to really think about what's our relationship to technology is are we are we being mindful of how much time we're spending on these devices? What are we looking at? How is it nourishing us, feeding us? When do we need to take a break? When do we need to regulate it? When do we need to, maybe before we go check social media or the news or TikTok or Instagram, wherever we like, is, checking in with ourselves to check in with, where am I right now in this moment? Where am I able to take in whatever content may be there, and noticing when we're overwhelmed or stressed, or really tuned out, just numb, disconnected, and when do we need technology and when might we need to detox from it. I'm kind of one of those people. I trust when people say that they need to take a break from social media or whatever it might be. And I'm more of the, I just gonna do it in small dosages, and I'm gonna try not to take it too seriously, and know that that's true in the season of my life, and that may not be true in every season. I added nature or things related to the spirit, because we know that there's something about being in nature that is very soothing to a lot of people. And I also think about spiritual practices and how does that help maintain people and help people connect to something bigger than themselves. And when I think about healthy eating, um, I think about how do we decolonize our plate. And so, what does that mean? There's someone on social media that I like to follow. Her name is, she calls herself the Black Nutritionist. It's Dr. Kira. And she talks a lot about her target audience is women of color. And she wants them to really realize the ways in which colonization has given people the story that some foods are healthier than other foods, even if it's native to that person's culture. And so, some of the things to kind of think about when we're decolonizing our plate is how much of our culture is embedded in diet culture and policing people's bodies, and that as a society, we're really afraid of fatness, and there's a lot of fat phobia, and how do we help people not focus so much on BMI and recognize that the body mass index was created not originally to be like a major indicator of health, and yet evolved into that at some point, and that a lot of the early research around BMI was really centering on white bodies and not a broader spectrum of the global majority. So how do we start to notice the stories we might tell ourselves about eating and what's good foods and bad foods, and how do we reevaluate health and trust our body, trust the food? How do we fuel ourselves? How do we become mindful of, oh, when I eat this, I feel foggy or gassy, or my body doesn't feel good, right? Versus like diets that tell us like what to eat, even if some of us need that structure, right? And that's okay if we need structure, but to do it based on what works for our bodies, and to not be so afraid about how our body is evolving or changing. And how do we reconnect to our body's rhythm and whatever our healthy set point is? So that would be part of like the decolonize our plate, or the healthy eating or mindful eating, is that there isn't that one kind of plate fits all. And how do we start to unpack that? I think about um, mindfulness practices, and I really like some of the tenets of mindfulness, which is more about what's the attitude we're bringing into mindful activities rather than certain practices. And so when I think of like some of the foundations of mindfulness, I think about like how to be gentle with ourselves, with other people, and work towards being non-judgmental, which doesn't mean I never have judgmental thoughts. It's just, you know, noticing the judgments and turning the mind away from that, or not being so attached to the judgments. How do I create a generosity within myself, gratitude, being able to like this resilience, or being able to like hold uncomfortable things, learn to forgive, to be kind, compassionate, experience more joy and more steadiness, more equanimity of not being so ruffled by the waves of life. And so we're not striving for perfection, because, you know, we'll eventually fail if we are, but that these are attitudes we can bring into our daily life. I remember when I was first learning meditation, you know, I learned kind of originally like more of the MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is much more the monastic tradition of meditation, which is the path of renunciation, which is more about like detachment or non-attachment, or celibacy, or denying, or pushing away. Um, and like some of the language of renunciation is kind of like this monkey mind of, our mind is, you know, like a monkey jumping from tree to tree. And so, you know, the later years after I learned kind of that initial way of meditating, I found Loren Roche, and he talks about the path of intimacy. And he kind of talks about meditations that are meant for householders versus the monastic tradition, which was, you know, practiced by people who became monks and were taking a vow of celibacy. And so many of their practices were meant to help them live with less suffering in their monasteries. And people who are householders, meaning like they are not going to live in a monastery, they need different practices. So I think when we start to expand what we think meditation could be, we start to see that maybe more people could participate in it or see themselves practicing it. So just think about this language of attachment and detachment, right? Like, so how do I learn to attach more? I might still be non-attached, but I'm experiencing more joy, more of my sexuality, more pleasure. I'm more intimate versus pushing away or detaching. I'm able to generate wealth for myself and the people I care about. I can be more spontaneous, experience more desire. I can nest and express myself in the ways that help me to thrive and help me live in the world, and practice less avoidance. And it's so interesting. So instead of monkey mind, the path to intimacy would talk more about an exploring mind, right? So monkey mind for some people could be a judgment of like, oh, I messed up, I wasn't able to stay focused. Or it could be like my mind was designed to explore. And so of course it's going to explore, and maybe I can, sometimes I want to do practices that are going to help me stay focused because that's what I'm trying to cultivate, that muscle of coming back and beginning again. And sometimes I just want to go into my fantasy or go into exploration, and that gives me vitality, that gives me something that helps me move through the world a little bit more easily. And so Lauren Roche talks about the 8 R's, which are, um, the different rhythms that happen when we show up in meditation. And he often talks about, um, there's kind of 2 different energy states that often show up in meditation. One of them is restful. So that's when people describe feeling really calm in meditation. And and then there's equally times when we're restless, and and in that restless, it's maybe hard to sit, and we're exploring a lot of different things. And this idea of just noticing if you're more on the restful side or more on the restless side. And these are all the things that can happen when we're meditating. Is it can be a period of relaxing, releasing. We could be crying, we can be expending energy, we may be replaying things that happened, we may be repairing and healing things, we might be restoring ourselves, we might be rehearsing, we might be planning. Think about how our to-do lists could be acts of love in meditation. It's us trying to make sure we're prepared, that we're taking care of the people we care about, that we're doing a good job. And we might be remembering things, and it's a way to sort through the chatter of the mind. Or we may be resting. We may fall asleep because our body needs more rest than we're giving it. So things to think about, these 10 things, as like for you to think about how much of that are you doing in your life, and how can you support other people in your life also, adding these things as regular things in their life, and thinking about how capitalism or different bodies with different access to resources, how that may impact people's ability to practice these things and embody these things. And my last slide is just how you can stay in touch. On the left is this link tree, which has like access to my YouTube channel and websites and upcoming workshops and membership stuff. And on the right is just my Dr. Nat Edmond website. So I'm trying to get into the newer technology. But I would love to hear some of your questions or comments or how you're reacting to it. So I'm going to unshare my screen and see if there's any questions or comments.